And I said, what's up with the black Buick? And he said, oh, Chris, he goes, when you make it in business in China and you cut your teeth for the very first time, you buy yourself a black Buick.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey folks, we're on for Simply Trade Podcast. It's been a little while since Lila and I have been in the studio together. We've been doing some public appearances and traveling around and hitting different topics, a lot of things going on. So it's going to be an interesting discussion today because we're going to get to talk about tariffs and currencies and international trade and whatnot. So it's going to be actually a very good discussion. But with that, I guess, Lala, welcome back. It's kind of neat to be back in the studio here. We've had kind of you and I have gotten to see each other, recently in Michigan. So that was cool. So, how are you doing, my friend?
No, pretty good. Thank you. I've been trying to catch up. I mean, like you said, we've been traveling and doing some stuff. We're heading out again in about a week or so, or you are anyway, for IE Canada, and going to be presenting there in IE Canada. But I mean, it's just been a little crazy. So we were at AAEI last week. So no, I'm sorry, AIAG. Oh my gosh, so many acronyms.
Yeah, I know. It's like the alphabet soup here.
Yes, and so we were able to record a little bit or air on, in case y'all missed that podcast or episode, where we had Andy and the CEO of AIAG and the committee chair for the conference that we went to, which is the Customs and Trade town hall that they hold every year. So anyway, y'all should listen to that aired a couple of weeks ago. So anyway, yeah. So it's pretty good. A lot of people really liked your speech that you had there, and I thought it went well. So so it was pretty good.
Well, and appreciate that too. We're going to broadcast that, I think, on as one of our podcast shows. So it'll be getting into the economy and trade deficits and things of that nature. So that'll be cool. So, well, let's bring on Chris Scalisi. You right?
Yes, Scalisi. Yeah. So for today's show, we had a Chris. We met him prior to ICPA. And we had him, and when we were at ICPA in the fall, we got some time to catch up. And he's like, "Hey, Lalo, I gotta send you a paper that I just published, and it's just a perspective on." And it's kind of strange because Chris never pitched it to me as a political thing. I mean, but it's just like a lot of people nowadays. Back then, we were still in the middle of the election period, so by now it's all done. But it was in the forefront. People were talking about tariffs and talking about, protectionism and all the, depending on which candidate you were going to vote for, et cetera. But so he wrote this paper. I read it. And so today, we'll be diving into some nice insights on those global trade shifts. Basically, from tariffs to currency changes, what impact of those businesses and the economy would be, et cetera. So Chris, he brings in a perspective on here that helps us understand these challenges. Maybe look at a practical strategies to stay competitive and maybe resilient. We talked a lot about that during the last 4 years, during the previous administration or current administration. Let's just say that for various reasons, COVID, and then there was also geopolitical. Oh my goodness, there's so many different things. So anyway, just so everybody understands, this is not necessarily about politics and for or against one side or the other or anything. It's just a view. And we just recently learned that Chris is a history buff, and he's basing a lot of his thoughts and ideas behind history. And so it's really interesting. We do get guests that that come on our show that are big history buffs, like Larry.
Larry Hansen, he did a thing with the, it was the initial introduction of the institution of the World Trade Organization, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Everybody
It was
loved
like
that.
it was like a
history class,
Ivy League history class, and it was amazing. So anyway, we kind of like these because of that. We're going back in history, looking. They always say you don't want to repeat history. Well, then study history.
But you got to study history to avoid. Well, Chris, hey, welcome. You are with Faro now, right?
I am. I'm in Farrell. I'm in the private sector. I spent a good number of my career, half my international career, working in the NGO space, nonprofit, World Trade Organization, Canadian Consulate, county, doing international business development on the export side. And, I really enjoy trade. I think I shared with Laszlo we always call it the 5 fingers of trade, right? And it was market development, supply chain and logistics, international finance, international law, and trade compliance. And that's really what made my transition going from the non-government, nonprofit world to the evil private side, they call it, right? And I always like the compliance because these are the folks that are a critical part of a company's organization. They're usually overutilized, undervalued, understaffed. Salespeople want to look at them as killing the sales deal. Senior leadership looks at them as a cost. And I have to say, to this day, thanks to COVID, it really opened up the opportunity that trade compliance is really the evolution of the people having seats at the table. We see some of our friends at ICPA becoming chief compliance officers, vice president of trade compliance, where that spinoff of logistics from the 90s, these people are really evolving coming to the C-suite, which is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Well, with all said and done, as we're looking at it, there's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth right now with some of the things. All right, so we've obviously gotten through the election. Trump has been elected. Part of the things that Trump was saying out on the campaign field is that he's looking at hitting tariffs across the board on all goods coming in the U.S. and whatnot. And so now everybody's like, the sky's falling and it's in the world and as we know it. But that said, is in looking at it, you've got some points in here that I definitely want to get into and talk about as we get it. But taking basically the initial, threat of putting tariffs across the board, and that alone, just looking at that and nothing else happens, this is where a lot of things are coming into play saying, it's going to be a negative to the U.S. economy is what some of your points you're putting in thus far, right?
It based on, not on my perspective, but based on some of the research that I've done in the past, going back to the days on the Smoot-Hawley Act in the 1930s, the Nixon shock in the 1970s, where some of these tariffs were put into place. We've seen countries, both countries, as our favorite trade partners, but other countries as well, have gone in retaliatory tariffs, which have affected the economy. So one of the things I struggle with, and when coming from an export-driven world, some of the most successful companies, what they do is not only that they import, but they export at the same time. So whether they import a lot or they export a lot, but the ones that are doing that balance, those are the ones that are succeeding and those are thriving and are considered true global companies that are taking advantage of all the different opportunities that are out there to help them grow and be successful.
Well, and with that, that's the one thing that I always say, and folks, before we go any further, let me stop for a minute. This show is going to be something that you should be looking at from, gaining some information from a strategic planning perspective. This would be one definitely from your import-export compliance, your transportation, your upper echelon. These are items that we're going to hit that should stimulate your thoughts on, looking at the markets as a whole. And I'm saying markets, I'm like, if you're trying to penetrate current markets in other countries or even domestically and things of that nature. So as we're talking through this is one of those that you need to look at things, in my opinion, definitely more holistically rather than just one little item and all that. So, Chris, as far as that, why don't you go through a little bit here of what you're saying as far as the initial accusation? I want to say I don't know if I fully agree with this, but this is going to be a good discussion. Okay, so let's go ahead and throw on out there.
Yeah, please. And please interject at any time. And, one of the things, as I mentioned, from my career and starting in, international development and trade, and then also being a history buff, looking back to the days in, 1930 and the Smoot-Hartley Tariff Act, when the Great Depression happened in 1929, there was a need for protectionism, that we needed to come back and look at redeveloping these businesses and industries in the United States. And as a result, they created this additional tariffs on countries, not only just like countries from a distance, but countries even as Canada, France, and some of our favorite trader partners back then. That didn't go very well. And there's been a lot of papers that were created saying that, and studies done during the Great Depression that actually extended the Great Depression for a few years afterwards. And it wasn't until World War II that pulled the United States out of there. And where I see the correlation is between tariffs and our currency. We had a lot of things that were happening during that time. And we see, like, obviously World War II, it pulled us out. Not only it pulled us out of the Great Depression, but it really put us in the global economy. And it really made us, people, as we know, people that win wars rewrite history. And because the U.S. Was a big benefactor of, playing a big part of winning World War II, Bretton Woods was created, and then the agreement among these countries to say that we were going to adopt the global currency as the U.S. dollar. One of the most prosperous times, as people have said, is between 1948 and 1971, after World War II. And people go, why is that date that we look at? And we look at because 1971, that's when we look at Richard Nixon, the Nixon shock, we call it, right? Nixon shock does the same thing, where he created these 10% tariffs. As a result, countries were retaliating because of these tariffs, and it resulted on being on impacts not only on exports, but affecting those local companies as well. Coming from the export stages. Yeah, go ahead.
Because I was going to interject here real quick and say, although that may be true back then, how global or how interconnected were we all? As manufacturers, as society, as you know what I mean? Like, how much did we all depend so much? Like, if they retaliated against us, I feel like they may have depended a lot more on the U.S. Either now or then, or what? I don't know. I mean, like, in perspective then to now, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, and you're absolutely right, Lalo. And they did. There was a lot of reliance on when rebuilding Europe after World War II, and depending on these U.S. manufacturers to this. But as we fast forward from when the tariffs were put pre-World War II in 1930 to current day 1971, that both was the backlash of these countries saying, we need to have fair trade. There it is, and I agree. We definitely have to have tariffs, but we can't. And we live, as I always say, it's not our grandparents' economy like it was years ago.
All right, let's look at China. China, their market is not open, not only to the U.S., but to other countries around the world. And yet they make up 23% of our trade deficit. So as we're looking at this and we're talking about tariffs across the board, I'm looking at it from the standpoint that Trump is looking at getting these people to the table, negotiation table. But if you only put in the tariffs, then yeah, there's going to be gloom and doom. But if you don't do anything, then we're just going to continue on with trade deficits, and we'll sacrifice quote unquote cheap imports at the expense of U.S. exports.
So I'm gonna hear me out on this one, and I'm gonna pitch this to you and see what the thought and the feedback is on this. And you might take this wrong way or not, but let's see how it goes. When I was in China, and I've been there a couple times already in country, I was standing at the corner, and at the corner I saw a Maserati dealership, I saw a Mercedes dealership, and I saw a black Buick dealership. It was almost like that Sesame Street. One of these doesn't belong here, right? Singing the song. And I'm standing there watching the corner, and I'm looking around, and I went to my Chinese counterpart, and I said, something doesn't fit here. I could see the Maserati. I could see the Mercedes. And there was another one. It was another fancy car, whatever it was, on the four corners. And I said, what's up with the black Buick? And he said, oh, Chris, he goes, when you make it in business in China and you cut your teeth for the very first time, you buy yourself a black Buick. He goes, not because of the cost of the Buick. It's because of the cost to import it in the country. Hear me out. What the U.S. is doing wrong, and this is going back to my approach of a buy and sell local, a trade regional, and a buy and sell global approach, is we shouldn't be punishing the countries. We should be punishing the businesses. And you just hit it on the, Andy, and hear me out. If a company, they say it's equivalent to every $250,000 in exports equals one created job. And if what happens is, if I am importing more than I am exporting, I should be paying those tariffs, 60, 70, whatever those percentages are going to be. But if I am using some of that product and I'm exporting more into the countries, let's just do raw numbers, a million. If I am importing $1 million and I am exporting $500,000 worth of product, not just as a whole, dollar for dollar, then I should be paying those exuberant duties on the difference of the trade deficit to balance that trade. Okay. Now, what happens is the companies are now having that ability to shop the world for the best components, the best products that they can bring in and sell in. Now, in the world of Faro, what we do is we do help companies like that. We have it's duty recovery, duty drawback. Those are programs that if it's imported to the U.S. and it's re-exported out and they show the paper trail and the activity, they can apply for that drawback. But as an overall, they take advantage of those programs. But overall, the companies, why should we target the countries? China has 1.3 billion people in this country. Can you imagine how many black Buicks that we can sell, or how many new commodities that we should be bringing into? So the U.S. should be investing more into its companies, as saying, let's invest in these STEM companies. Let's invest in these startups. Let's help culture these. Let's teach these companies how to export. The U.S. ranks at the very bottom, towards the bottom of countries around the world that exports their products throughout the world. We're more selling within. That's the first problem. China is selling number one importer to 120 countries around the world. And Canada is our number two traded partner. China is Canada's number two partner. So where we're doing here is, and this is where I'm saying, it doesn't say, where we open up trade, because China has closed borders. It is a tactic in such of what they're doing. But can you imagine if we open up the border between said, China, we're going to do free trade with the United States, but we're going to penalize our countries, our companies. If they're exporting less than what they're importing, then we're going to put those tariffs on there. And then use that tariff money to reinvest into export programs to help teach these companies how to do business abroad in these countries. It helps develop it. Everybody wins, and it creates diplomacy across the board.
But overall, Chris, I would say, for your perspective, is that in looking at this, I always say, look at holistically this whole situation, this trade scenario. Because, trading regionally helps. Trading with partners that are going to help us and all that. And we need to kind of maybe shift this into the BRICS currency scenario here as well. But on these trade relations and things, if nothing else is done and Trump the Trump administration puts in tariffs across the board with no strategy and no idea of what they want from the other countries, just like that was the downfall of Nixon and all of putting those things in. And it's like, well, what is it we want to do? And they stopped international trade, and they didn't. Then we're going to be in a world of hurt. I'm looking at it going, these are tools to get people to the negotiating table to say, we want fair trade. Canada, U.S., Mexico, all of us want the playing field to be fair when we're dealing with international trade with other countries.
Oh, I agree. We're definitely saying the same thing. And, and we talk about free trade, and then there's obviously what we should look at is what is fair trade. But it's amazing to see how, these companies that, where we look at, these, how many 20 million companies or so that are currently in the United States, how many of those, only a very small amount percentage is actually selling abroad. Then it goes up a little higher when you look at Canada. It looks at more favored states, but it's favorite countries. But it's amazing that, and I agree with you, Andy, that we need at the macro level, if we have instances like Germany that are punishing the tariffs coming in for U.S. cars going in there, we need to put a stance, dig our stance in the ground and say, look at, we're going to put these tariffs on you because you're not giving us that lane open. It should be reciprocal on both, between both countries. But then peeling the onion back, we need to look at the companies to say, okay, what are you doing? Are you exploiting, bringing in cheap product from countries then and selling it at high margins and then, basically, profiting from it? Or what are you exporting? Are you creating jobs? What are you building in the economy? And I think that's where a program needs to be built. It's almost like a two-tiered approach. Like you said, create that free lanes between countries that trade fairly with one another, but then go to the companies to say, well, how much are you importing and how much are you really exporting? You're the one that's creating the balance of trade being off. So
the growth, and you make it reference it. What's great is that for every $1 billion of trade equates to 10,000 jobs. Of that 10,000 jobs, 6,000 of them, almost 6,000, are tied to exports. Another 4,000 is into the imports of that country. So, the more it grows, the better off we are. And that's where I'm looking at it going, okay, so what do we do? Here's one of the other factors. So let's move into, you were talking about the BRICS currency. Folks, for that, there's Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa have joined forces in trying to move away from the U.S. dollar as like an international currency almost. It's for business transactions, and they want to stop using the U.S. dollar. And they are looking at potentially coming up with their own currency or using one of their own country's currency for business transactions. Now, why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because I see that as an effort to circumvent the sanctions against Russia and China and India and some of the others. Iran's part of that deal too, and some of these countries that are anti-U.S.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. And I'm going to go back and step back a little bit back to our history again, back to our 1970s with the Nixon era. Nixon taking us off the, and this is actually this is fascinating. This actually was a Jeopardy question last night. And my wife and I are big Jeopardy fans. And did you guys aware of I think it was I'm just looking at my notes here.
71 or 72, wasn't it?
74. We were actually, 71, he took us off the gold standard, right? 74, anytime between now and 1974, we could buy gold. But between 1974 and it was 1934, I believe, the U.S., you could not hoard gold. And I thought that was really fascinating. So what happened was, let's go back in time. So 1974, 1971, Nixon takes us off the gold standard and pegs us to the dollar itself, the faith of the currency of the United States dollar. At the same time, Nixon, 1974, they allowed us, we could start purchasing gold again. And then the same time, he negotiates with the OPEC countries that gold is going to be bought and sold under U.S. dollars. So there was a 50-year agreement made with Saudi Arabia, hence born the petrodollar. Okay. Fast forward in 2019, 2020, COVID comes. And what happens is the countries outside the United States around the world are looking at the United States and they're saying, wow, the U.S. is printing a lot of money. They're issuing a lot of money that's out there. How is this affecting our economies ourselves? So lo and behold, the BRICS, as you mentioned, Brazil, Russia, India, Russia, and China got together and said, we need to put a stop on this. First of all, the U.S. is not going to bully us and tell us that we're going to put sanctions on Russia or our countries if we do something wrong or incorrectly. And why is the U.S. printing all these dollars? And we need to not only get our BRIC countries involved, but we need to get these other countries to buy in as well. And Andy, like you said, countries such as Iran, North Korea, and actually 52 other countries as well, and growing, including Saudi Arabia, which their pact, a 50-year pact just expired, said, we'd like to be part of this. And it's fascinating because what they wanted to do was to come up with some type of uniform currency, whether it was crypto, monetary, whatever it may be. They couldn't come to an agreement. Actually, it's being driven more heavily by India and China and such. So it's amazing how the dynamics it was said. If we would have did this show if Kamala Harris was elected, I would have probably had a different perspective and said that these countries this is something that's going to be accelerated and moving forward. Lo and behold, last night I was reading through the presses. It was saying that Russia has made some concerns that they're thinking about the BRICS currency isn't a good idea. That maybe we should be looking back at the dollar. South Africa, for example, is looking at possibly leaving the BRICS. So it's really fascinating how the dynamics of a U.S. election, whether if this party came in or this party came in, how much that momentum has changed. This is something that BRICS has been brought up daily in the global news and not much in the U.S. economy, in the U.S. papers. That they were moving forward, they've had multiple meetings, they had multiple discussions. Now, whether a BRICS currency is going to happen, it may or may not. Whether a cryptocurrency might happen as a universal, it may or may not happen, or maybe the dollar will stay the same. No one knows, but only time will tell. But it's really fascinating how we see over time. In a sense, we look at a trade war that's going on, but in a sense, there's a financial war going on between these countries and saying, how can we position ourselves as not only a top tier economy, but how that we can get an upper leg on the United States. So it's a good thing. I'm excited to see that there's some breaks in the brick wall, we call it, right? And it's happy to see that maybe people are reconsidering that this might not come to fruition.
What is it, in your opinion, that people should be looking at to counter this?
Absolutely. I've been putting a lot of thought into this. And it goes back to the saying that we probably learned from our grandpa, right? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And I say that wholeheartedly as saying what people need to do is really take a step back and look at their supply chains. Who are we doing business with? Where are we doing business with? Are we visiting the country? Are we visiting these countries where their plants or where we're sourcing? What are the free trade? It's almost like peeling the onion and doing that risk assessment. What free trade agreements are we have right now in place? What plants which ones are we don't have in place? What are the countries have we visited and seen the plans of activities that are happening and such? And then doing that full risk assessment, and then also look at the financial part of it too. Is there opportunity that we could take advantage of financial recovery? And that's where I swear by that. Buy and sell local, trade regional, and buy and sell and global, because you want to look at not just that little ecosystem where you live in, whether if it's Buffalo, New York, or Dallas, Texas, or wherever it may be. You want to really think globally. And then what you want to do is not only just think globally, look at your positions and where your moves are, and then make decisions from there.
Excellent, excellent, yeah. Excellent.
We probably should.
I was just going to say, we're going to need to try and wrap this up.
We can go on. I'll tell you, yeah.
Well, I enjoy the conversation here, but well, let me just say this: as far as looking at it, sourcing your goods, it would be wise to continue to look at, nearshoring, as people call it, regional, supply chains and all that. Obviously, the U.S. economy is so massive. It's like we have a lot in our domestic side of things. But vet who you're doing business with and who they're doing business with. It may be that, hey, you got a good relationship, but then come to find out they're doing some other things that is like, you know what? In the long run, that hurts the country. Hence, you got to make your own decision on that strategically. But, well, Chris, any last thoughts from you?
No, this is great. Well, I'll tell you, I'm a big fan of what you guys do and helping to spread the word and getting these information out to our companies and our folks. And that's what I like about the trade community. It is a big world out there, but we're all interconnected and here to help and support one another. So it's a good group, and keep up the great work you guys are doing.
Well, I appreciate that. Lalo, any last moments that we need to talk about here before we sign off?
We're good to go. Thank you, everyone. I mean, we're glad you're tuning in, and we hope to bring more of these shows for you all.
No. Well, folks, let me just say real quick is that if there are some things that Chris and I and Lalo have been talking about and you think we're full of beans, then you know what? Let us know. Send us a comment. Do something here. And come on the show. Be willing to talk with us and debate some of this. I will also say this, though. We greatly, greatly appreciate it. Every time we get to go out and do a public appearance, oh, my gosh, it is so cool. People coming up, taking selfies with us and talking with us. It is just phenomenal. So we greatly appreciate that. Please, if you've not already done it, subscribe to our show. Chris, we're going to put your contact information also in our show notes and whatnot. But thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us today.
I appreciate you guys having me. Like I said, I follow you guys' podcast. You guys have great topics of discussion, and every time I always learn something new, and that's what we're here for. And it's just you guys just bring the meeting of the minds together, and there's always great pieces of information to take home value, and I really enjoy that.
Well, that's fantastic. Appreciate that. Well, with that, folks, we're going to turn it over to you. I hope you all have a great day. So take care.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.